Before we get into the content of the idea, what is the challenge that inclusive vanguardism is addressing?
In every historical circumstance, there is a most advanced practice of production. In the past historical period, it was mechanized manufacturing that resulted in mass production, industrial mass production. Now we have another advanced practice of production that we could call the knowledge economy. It is experimentalism, it is dense in ideas, and it has the potential radically to change our economic prospects. The problem is that it remains confined now to fringes in each sector of the economy. The vast majority of the labor force remains excluded from these fringes. If we could find a way to disseminate this advanced practice of production throughout the economy, we would have discovered the most powerful instrument. First, for the acceleration of economic growth. Second, for the diminishment of inequality. And third, and more generally, for the lifting up of ordinary men and women to a higher plane of capability and experience.
So let me see if I can unpack this for a second. So vanguardism, so we have this word inclusive vanguardism. You're saying that right now we have an exclusive vanguard.
We have an insular vanguardism. We have a new practice of production, this knowledge-intensive, experimentalist way of producing things, but it remains quarantined within small parts of the economy and in the hands of a technological and entrepreneurial elite. So the frontier of the economy, the vanguard, instead of being the point of departure for the transformation of the whole economy, remains arrested within these narrow parts of production.
So in America, the exclusive vanguard is, say, in Silicon Valley.
We often identify the knowledge economy simply with high-tech industry, and high-tech industry is indeed the most tangible manifestation of this form of production. But potentially, this new way of producing things should be applicable to any part of the economy. And it is present in every part of the economy in the form of scientific precision agriculture or knowledge-intensive services, as well as advanced manufacturing. But in each sector of the economy, it appears as a fringe.
So let's talk a bit about what makes something part of the knowledge economy as opposed to what makes it part of the vanguard instead of the rearguard. If not, they use computers.
Its characteristics. So let's begin with the superficial attributes. The accumulation of technology and knowledge, as well as of capital. Then if we go one level down to the methods of production, or what you could call production engineering, there are two characteristics of this advanced practice of production. One is that it combines destandardization or customization with large scale. So in traditional mass production, what we had before this knowledge economy, there was a division between standardized mass production and non-standardized craft production. Now we have technologies like 3D printers that allow us to de-standardize but retain large scale. Second characteristic at the level of production engineering of this form of production is that it requires a great decentralization of initiative in the actual process of production. More trust and more discretion to all the participants in the process of production. But at the same time, it must maintain central coordination, coherence, momentum in the plan of production. So a simple way to understand this is to contrast a traditional infantry battalion with its command and control structure to a guerrilla or special forces operation. The higher the level, the more the ability of the rank and file participants down below to take initiative in the theater according to circumstance, but without losing the coherence of the battle plan. That's what happens in this form of production, at this second level that I'm describing.
I think also to clarify this, it might be interesting to contrast it with what is the rear guard? What's the experience of consumption and production in the non-vanguard?
So we have two main rear guards. There are two major forms of economic life that stand in clear contrast to this advanced practice of production. One is the traditional mass production, sometimes called Fordist mass production, by allusion to Henry Ford's assembly line. It is the large-scale production of standardized goods and services by relatively rigid machines and production processes on the basis of semi-skilled labor and in the context of very specialized and very hierarchical relations of production. So first, it stands in contrast to that, to the previous advanced practice of production. But second, it also stands in contrast to regressive traditional small business and largely family business in much of the world. And in most economies all over the world, most people are in this world of retrograde small business.
So the first rear guard you described is like the experience of being a worker in a factory. You show up, you do a routinized task.
Henry Ford's assembly line, Adam
You have
Smith's
a boss
pin
that
factory.
tells you what to do.
You are in a world in which the worker acts as if he were one of his machines. The machine, like a traditional machine cutting lathe, goes through a series of standardized repetitious operations. And the worker works as if he were one of his machines. He too does a small subset of these repetitious operations.
And let's get into let's go deeper and get into why
into the deeper characteristics. Let me just signal a few of these deeper characteristics. First, there is in the knowledge economy the potential to relax or even overcome what has been historically the most universal constraint in economic life, which is the constraint of diminishing returns in production. The basic intuitive idea is if you devote more inputs to the production of something, eventually there is a declining curve of reward for these increasing inputs. That's diminishing returns. The constraint of diminishing returns has the strongest credential to be considered, quote, a law in economics more than anything else. But in the knowledge economy, we find at least the promise that this constraint of diminishing returns might be loosened or even superseded. And think of it intuitively. It's that if production is the materialization of knowledge,
Yeah.
the more you know, the easier it is to do the next thing. And it becomes less close to nature, to a natural process, and closer to the work of the imagination. And that proximity to the work of the imagination brings with it the prospect of overcoming the constraint of diminishing returns. A second deep attribute, it has to do with a change in the social and moral character of production. The world of mass production is a world in which there is a stark contrast between planning the work of production and implementing it.
Yeah.
A distinction between the supervisors and the implementers, and then among the implementers, highly rigid and specialized roles. With this new form of production comes the imperative of attenuating the contrast between conception and execution, and with that, relativizing the distinctions among all specialized work roles. Now, if we could place this in a larger context and say what's happening is that the way we cooperate in work, the so-called technical division of labor, is becoming closer to the work of the imagination.
Yeah.
Our practice of cooperation is becoming a collective embodiment of the imaginative side of the mind. And that has a whole range of practical implications. One practical implication has to do with the change in the relation between the worker and the machine.
Yeah.
I mentioned a moment ago,
Yeah.
under traditional mass production, the worker works as if he were one of his machines.
Yeah.
Now the machines become more flexible. Numerically controlled machine tools can be reprogrammed. But we conceive the idea that the worker becomes an anti-machine. Everything that we've learned how to repeat, we can express in a formula.
Yeah.
Everything that we can express in a formula, we can embody in the machine. The machine does for us everything that we've learned how to repeat so that we can reserve our time for the not yet repeatable.
Yes. So I'm going to do a quick summary and then ask about something that I feel isn't mentioned in this. So quick summary first. In Fordist mass production, hierarchical experience of being a worker, you're controlled, you're doing repetitive tasks like the machine that you're interacting with. At, say, in the knowledge economy, I'll use an example in the popular imagination, say teams of software engineers at Google. They're constantly switching teams, they're constantly programming new ideas, they think something up, they go create it, things like that. So that covers the difference between factories and the software engineers at Google, but let me just bring up...
Let me qualify there a statement so that there's no misunderstanding. If what I said before were taken as a description of the existing form of the knowledge economy, it could be criticized as an idealization.
Yes.
Now, it's not a description in any simple sense. It's a conception of the potential of this form of production. The potential is limited insofar as this form of production remains quarantined in the fringes rather than disseminated. In the advance of every form of production, there is a relation between its deepening and its dissemination.
Yes.
We discover its potential only to the extent that it spreads throughout the economy. So we now know it only in this superficial form,
Yes.
as in the form it takes in Silicon Valley in the
Yes.
high-tech industry. So what I was presenting as an account of the knowledge economy was an account of its promise, not an account of its present reality.
Yes. I understand. So the dream is that in every industry we start disseminating these practices. And
that the potential that I described of loosening or reversing the constraint of diminishing returns, creating a practice of production that is radically experimentalist,
yes.
in which each participant shares in the experimentation, uh, raising the level of trust and discretion that is both permitted and required, and bringing cooperation closer to the imagination. This is the promise, but it's what you could call the radicalization of the knowledge economy.
Yes.
But the radicalization of the knowledge economy is intimately associated with its economy-wide propagation.
Yes. And so it's not singing the praises of Silicon Valley. It's saying take the best practices that they embody.
Now we have a perversion of the knowledge economy.
Okay.
And let's describe one aspect of this perversion. The mega businesses of the high-tech industry spin off from their process of production everything that they can commoditize, that they can treat as a commodity, and they can be produced by the standard repetitious means of mass production. And then they now, in a global scale, allocate these pieces of production to people in China, for example, that are producing in the most conventional way. So then what happens is that the knowledge economy, instead of spreading throughout the economy, retreats and into an inner circle of this entrepreneurial and technological elite. It was already insular, and now it becomes hyper insular.
This addresses what might be appearing if someone just heard your argument on its face. Their first critique might be, okay, I'm going to give some concrete examples for the audience. At Amazon, at the headquarters in Seattle, they're being very creative. They're being a knowledge economy, but then they spin off their warehouses and run them like Fordist mass production. Or Uber, where they have creative people coding the app, but then they throw drivers.
In Cupertino, California, a small group of people inventing new devices and technologies, and then the actual making, the physical making of them, will be allocated to thousands of people under Foxconn in China, producing in the most conventional way at low wages.
And you're saying you should bring the best of the knowledge economy to even those places too. They should not spin them off.
Well, this is another problem that we can come to, which is the significance of this issue of the confinement of the vanguard to the developing countries.
Before we get to that, I think there's an imagination gap that is even domestic before we get to the developing country here in America. I think the first step that's stopping people from believing that the knowledge economy can be disseminated to the other industries is they think that certain industries are so much more susceptible to having this vanguardism and others. And let me give you examples. Very rapidly growing industries in America. The rapidly growing jobs in America are home health care, nurses in the house with old people, services like lawn care and massages, things that can't be exported, and low-wage work in fast food. How can we overcome this gap in not having the imagination to believe that those can have the qualities of the knowledge economy.
It's not true. Every practice, every part of economic life can be transformed on this model. Of course, the particular arrangements will be different, but there's no intrinsic relation of experimentalist, knowledge-intensive production to any one part of the economy. Contrast this to what came before. The previous most advanced practice of production was mechanized manufacturing that resulted in the industrial mass production that arose in the late 19th century and then in the 20th century. It began in manufacturing, in industrial manufacturing, and throughout its history, it retained an association with industrial manufacturing. Nevertheless, it influenced every part of the economy. Every part of the economy was transformed to some extent on the model of industrial mass production, even agriculture.
Yeah.
Now we have a most advanced practice of production that on its face, in principle, should be susceptible to even more universal dissemination, because its technologies and its methods are not intrinsically limited to any part of the economy. For example, we find that in this knowledge economy, even in the relatively superficial and very confined form that it now takes, the distinction between manufacturing and services is breaking down. Advanced manufacturing can be understood as crystallized intellectual services. The materialization of the conception is almost an afterthought.
Yeah, they call it
And
software as a service.
And not
That's a
the,
phrase.
and
Yeah,
not the essence of the process. Nevertheless, and this is the great enigma, this practice of production remains confined to the islands. It's no longer manufacturing against the rest of the economy. It's the fringe in each sector of the economy against everything else. And this has tremendous consequences. Let's focus on the two major sets of consequences. One is economic stagnation. You know, there is now in the United States a discourse that goes under the label of secular stagnation, borrowing Irving Fisher's term from the mid-20th century, that attempts to naturalize the economic slowdown, attributing it, for example, to what is supposedly the intrinsically lesser potential of contemporary information and communication technologies when compared to the technological innovations of 100 years ago. It's preposterous. These contemporary technologies have a vast revolutionary potential that has been barely tapped. A fundamental cause of economic stagnation in the contemporary rich economies is this confinement of the form of production that has the greatest potential to raise productivity to the islands or to the fringes. Equally, this phenomenon of the confinement has vast implications for inequality.
Yeah.
We have a deepening chasm between the vanguard and the rest. And the traditional devices for attenuating the consequences of this chasm, which are compensatory redistribution by progressive taxation or social entitlements.
Taxes that pay for social programs.
And social programs. Or the defense of small business, traditional retrograde small business, against big business.
Regulation and antitrust. Yeah.
It's not just regulation and antitrust, it's different forms of support for small
Oh
business.
yeah, it's subsidies too. Yeah.
These two traditional devices are inadequate to the task of moderating the vast inequalities that result from the abyss between the vanguard and the rest.
Yeah, in some ways, that's the opening premise of this, which is that you can't just accept the economic institutions as they are and then solve for it on tax day. You have to intervene in the institutions of the economy if you really want to address
There
economic.
comes this great theme that we have 200 years of ideological dispute organized around the contrast between the market and the state. More market, less government, more government, less market, or some synthesis of market and state, the regulated market economy or the social market economy, as the Europeans call it. And in this view, the dominant project now of the governing elites of the North Atlantic countries is to reconcile American-style economic flexibility with European-style social protection within a barely adjusted version of the established economic institutions. What is missing from this point of view is the idea that the market order, the market economy, is not there on a take it or leave it basis. We don't have to choose just between having more or less of the present market order and more or less state intervention in that order. We can have a different market order. And we must have a different market order if we are to succeed in creating the conditions for the dissemination of the knowledge economy.
To just summarize what you said and see if I'm getting this right, the main North Atlantic debate is the confinement is, okay, let's accept the current institutions of the economy, free market, let's give that everything, deregulate, let it work on its own, and then afterwards have social programs that address the inequalities, pour sugar on it to make sure that it's humanized. But what no one is doing is actually intervening in the institutions of the market.
I wouldn't call it intervening. I would call it reinventing.
Reinventing, yes. Yeah.
Step by step. Because intervening gives the idea that there's a thing, the market, and you intervene in it. You change it. Let's take the historical example of the United States in the first half of the 19th century. There were a number of sectors in which the Americans, in the initial period of their national life, reinvented the market economy, especially agriculture and finance. So in agriculture, they rejected the path of agrarian concentration that England had traveled, and that the Marxists considered intrinsic to what they described as capitalism. They distributed the lands on the agricultural frontier, and they organized what in today's vocabulary we would call decentralized strategic coordination between the government and the family farmers, and cooperative competition among the family farmers. They weren't regulating the market in agriculture. They were creating a kind of agricultural market economy that hadn't existed before. And it became the basis of the most efficient practice of agricultural production in the world in that time. The same thing happened in finance. They disbanded the National Bank in the second Bank of the United States in the presidency of Andrew Jackson. And they then went on to create the most decentralized system of credit at the disposal of the producer as well as the consumer, the remarkable network of local banks of 19th century America that had ever existed. They weren't regulating the capital market, they were creating a new kind of capital market. So the suggestion here is that not following the content of these examples, but the method, that's what we must now do in spades.
And we haven't done it for so long that we feel the current arrangement is natural and necessary.
So we have in the United States two main traditions of progressive reform. There's the tradition that goes from Jefferson to Brandeis of defending the little guy, the smallholder, the small business, the individual proprietor, against big business and the control of the economy by big business. And then there's the tradition that arose with the progressivism of the late 19th and early 20th century associated with the first Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt. Accept the command of the economy, the control of the commanding heights of the economy by big business, but place big business under strong regulation by national government. What these two traditions of progressive reform have in common, the defense of the little against the big, and the acceptance of the big regulated by the central government, what they have in common is that they don't dispute the institutional arrangements of the market order. That's not what happened in those early 19th century examples.
There's another tradition you're finding.
So what really built the country in the early 19th century was the combination of the mobilization of national resources by an elite that had a project of building the country,
Hamilton,
what you could call the Hamiltonian project, with this selective democratization of economic opportunity in particular sectors, such as agriculture and finance. That marriage of a movement from above in the mobilization of national resources and the sector by sector democratization below was the real formula of American development that these subsequent traditions of progressive reform failed to reinvent.
So let's talk about continuing that tradition and what it would take. And I know when you're putting forth these ideas, you're not just talking to, say, the president or the Speaker of the House. You're talking to everyone can participate in political projects. So I'm going to go through some different roles, and I'd be interested in see how you'd speak to them. So let's start with the one that's obvious, which is a government domestic policy director of a major party. What can the federal government or state governments do to promote broadening inclusive vanguardism?
Well, we have to distinguish different forms of action, and one form of action is ideas, the development of ideas. Everyone is at the mercy of the available ideas. The politicians tend to think that their only problem are the practical obstacles, the contending interests, the economic constraints. But the greatest obstacle of all is not knowing what to do. So Franklin Roosevelt, when he was President of the United States in the midst of the great crisis of the 1930s, was a genuinely bold experimentalist. But the experimentalism of the early New Deal ended up under the sway of a very narrow set of ideas that we now call corporatist. Concerted action between the government and business, especially big business, to restabilize the economy rather than to democratize it. And then in the subsequent period, the second step of the New Deal, the focus narrowed even more to the provision of antidotes to economic insecurity, such as the Social Security program.
Yeah.
Now, why is it that Franklin Roosevelt, being as open and as searching as he was, ended up as an instrumentality of these corporatist ideas? Because those were the ideas that were available to him. And you don't find the ideas that you need just because you want to have them. It's a struggle. So that's the first thing.
Yeah.
Then that we need to change the assumptions, and that involves an engagement with the orthodoxies of the most influential disciplines,
yes.
beginning with economics and with law. Then we have to identify a series of issues that are, as it were, at the cusp, at the point of interaction between the conventional non-structural discourse and the structural alternatives. So one such issue is this one, of the confinement or dissemination and the therefore the diminishment or the radicalization of the most advanced practice of production,
yes.
the knowledge economy. A second issue of great significance of this kind has to do with the financing of the government. The tendency of the progressives in the United States and in the other rich countries is to genuflect to progressive taxation, and to show whose side they're on. But they know, or they should know, that progressive taxation, at least in the short term, has only a marginal effect on inequality. What matters most is the institutional organization of economic opportunity. How you arrange access to the resources and opportunities of production. That's what matters most.
Yep.
More than any corrective redistribution. The arrangements that influence the initial or primary distribution of economic advantage, rather than the attempt to correct that distribution after the fact through taxation and social programs. Then when you come to the budget, to the activity of the state, what matters most in the short term is not how progressive the tax system is on the revenue raising side. It's the aggregate level of the tax take and how it's spent.
Yeah.
And then third, you come to the issue of progressive taxation,
yeah.
and having a tax system that is in fact progressive. For example, by taxing individualized consumption, the hierarchy of standards of living.
So on that budget question, though, I want to ask about two things. One is the standard left of center budget policy is programs of economic security that you call compensatory redistribution. Part of it is about inequality, but a lot of it's about economic security, not just about taking money from the rich, but giving money to the precarious.
Yes.
Is not, but before we get to new forms of spending the budget to organize the economy differently, such as funding cooperation, funding new ways, funding public venture capital to have more people become entrepreneurs, to have employment resemble entrepreneurship.
So is it not important that people have these safeguards?
Yes.
It is not just important, it's vital. But we have to have the right conception of them.
Yeah.
So the fundamental attitude of the contemporary progressives is pietistic rather than transformative. So the way they think is the great ideological struggles of the 20th century are over. What's left for the progressives is to humanize the established order, to regulate it, to manage it by countercyclical monetary and fiscal policies, and to render it less cruel. They're the humanizers. Through progressive taxation and through social programs. That's not the right conception. People have to have a basic stake, a social inheritance, and provision against economic insecurity, so that they can raise a store, so that they can participate in the work of reconstruction and innovation. And therefore, in this project, there are two parts that have to go together. One part is you give people this security, the way a parent gives security to the child when the parent says to the child, I love you unconditionally. But then comes the second part. The second part is the raising of the storm. Now, the raising of the storm has an institutional content. That has to do with the institutional reorganization of the market order so that everyone can participate in one way or another in the experience of creation,
Yes.
of innovation, of reconstruction. The centerpiece of this idea is not a conception of equality. It's a conception of freedom, of greatness, of a shared bigness. And the struggle against inequality is subsidiary to this larger aim of allowing ordinary men and women to participate in the work of innovation and of reconstruction. That's the central idea of democracy. Faith in the constructive genius of ordinary men and women. But that idea of raising ordinary human life up to a higher plane of intensity, scope, and capability has to be married to a practice of piecemeal but cumulative institutional reconstruction. And in our conversation, institutional reconstruction focused on the conditions for the universal dissemination of this most advanced practice of production.
Just to restate that, tell me if I'm getting this right, is I think the vast majority of people, though they don't necessarily like it, are resigned to the belief that, we're going to have an elite that will take care of things. Most of us have to just do their job. The former president used to say, everyone just gets a fair shot, and if you play by the rules, it'll be okay. And that's the idea. But you're saying everyone has the capability to be
bigger.
Everyone has
Bigger.
An elite.
Everyone
Preserve
wants
the elite.
to be bigger.
Yeah.
Everyone has the secret intention to ascend to a higher plane of existence. And this intention takes perverted forms in our experience, forms of false transcendence. The greatest experience of the most terrible experience of mass suffering that we have had in the last 100 years was the Second World War. In the Second World War, rates of suicide and depression fell precipitously in all of the belligerent powers, and then rose again as soon as peace was reestablished. Now, why is this? It's because people were forced by this terrible experience to forget about themselves and to be engaged in something larger than themselves, which is what they really want. But we shouldn't need to be slaughtering one another to have that experience. We should we should we should be able to form our economic and political life so that it gives us a chance to be bigger. Huh? And the discussion of uh, inclusive vanguardism, of the radicalized and disseminated form of the knowledge economy, is simply one of the many expressions of that larger agenda.
It seems like, and I think we should end on this. William James gave that challenge. What is the moral equivalent of war? I think after World War One, not after World War II. And he, I think, was imagining another large event like this. But what you're proposing is to disseminate the extraordinary to make it ordinary.
But so that this not appear to those who were watching and hearing us as just a fantasy, let's just summarize very briefly the practical conditions for this inclusive vanguardism. It would be the theme of another conversation. So broadly, there are three sets of conditions. First, there are educational and cognitive conditions. To have this inclusive vanguardism, people have to be educated in a certain way. For example, one of the characteristics of their education is that it has to be dialectical, from opposing points of view. They can't be enslaved to the orthodoxies of the university culture. From the earliest education on, every subject has to be taught at least twice from contrasting points of view. Now, a second set of conditions are the moral and social conditions. This form of production, to be radicalized and disseminated, requires an enhancement of our cooperative abilities. It demands a higher level of trust and discretion. So then we have to begin to organize society so that it teaches us how to cooperate. Education has to be cooperative. Civil society has to be engaged cooperatively together with the government in the provision of public services. And there has to be, as an alternative to military service, some form of social service, voluntary or mandatory. The third set of conditions are the institutional and legal conditions. Those are the most difficult. And we have to imagine a whole process. At the beginning, very modest measures of opening access to not just the capital, but to advanced technology and practice, to a much larger part of the economy. But then ultimately, progressing toward a form of economic decentralization in which the market economy is not pinned down to a single version of itself. Different regimes of property and contract coexist experimentally within the same market order. We need structural alternatives. As the liberals and socialists of the 19th century recognized that we need to change the world. But unlike the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we resist subscribing to a dogmatic formula. We have to discover the way along the way. So everything in our economic and political life needs to be arranged to facilitate the experimental revision of the established order in the economy and in politics. Now, then you could ask, if we have these three sets of conditions, what are the general features of culture and of politics that make it more or less likely that we can satisfy these requirements? In culture, the strengthening of an experimentalist impulse in every department of social life. The Americans believe in experimentalism. but they always gave their institutions an exemption
Yes.
from the experimentalist impulse. They need to lift that exemption. And in politics, the creation of a high energy democracy that doesn't need crisis in order to bring about change. A series of innovations in the political institutions that would raise the temperature of politics, that is, the level of civic engagement in public life, that would hasten the pace of politics by resolving impasse quickly, for example, through early elections when there's a stalemate, and a combination of the potential for strong central initiative by the national government with deviation by different parts of the country so that they can create counter models of the national future. Society goes down a certain path, but it hedges its bets, allowing a part of itself to create a different view. So we can't reach this inclusive vanguardism as the technological and entrepreneurial elite sometimes imagines, just by a kind of vegetative horizontal extension. They look around them and they say, well, why isn't the rest of the country like us? And it's not like that. The inclusive vanguardism that we're discussing is a transformative project. It requires a transformation of education, of the moral culture of the society, and of its economic and ultimately also its political institutions. And that transformation has to be driven not just by a set of material interests, but by an ideal. And the ideal is the ideal of a shared bigness, of everyone becoming bigger together. That's the idea of democracy.
On that note, thank you.
Thank you.